In this lesson, we'll take a look at the mental ray cube1 environment lookup. So for the demonstration of this scene, we'll just use a very simple object. So just like all the other environment shaders, this is going to be connected to the camera as an environment. So we'll go to the environment shader tab. Let's scroll down and drop in our cube1. So we actually have two different types of cubes, a cube1 and a cube6. We'll talk about the cube6 in its own lesson. So let's drop in our cube1. Let's go ahead and plug in the texture for this. And really, as far as the texture that we use, we can use anything that we want just for demonstration's sake. You could use something like our garden background for this. Now let's take a look back at the actual cube lookup node. If we were to simply render this right now, we probably wouldn't see much of anything. And you can see that that is exactly the case. The reason is right now is because for the moment the cube doesn't actually know how to orient itself within the scene. So what we first need to do before we can actually see this is to give it some sort of a direction or some sort of a place in space. So what we can do is click on this and let's drop in a texture vector node. So let's scroll down, we'll plug in a texture vector. There we go, and with this we actually have several different ways in which we can project this image, but let's just take a look at what we have right now and see if we're on the right track here. So you can start to see that we do have some kind of a result here now. Now the reason that we actually start to have some of these odd little areas of just these sort of blocky pixels is that we actually need to come in and start to define some kind of a selection space for this to be projected in. Now as far as the way that you use, or the way that you will need to project yours, it may entirely depend on your particular scene. So one of the reasons I'm using just a very simple object for this particular example is because of the fact that we can now come in and use something like the IPR, come in and just tune an area, and then we can come in and start to choose these different selection modes. So as far as the way that we can go anywhere from -1 down to a -10, I believe. So you can see as we start to change these, -2, -3, we're changing the way in which this texture will actually be projected. In my case, -4 seems to work best. Now if none of the negative values work for you, you can actually go up to positive values. So you can go up to a positive value of up to 63. And again, this is only just determining different ways and different methods in which this image will be projected. It's just simply cycling through different projection modes. So in my case, -4 activates the projection type that, in my case, works best for me. And we can also, within this texture vector node, start to choose different selection spaces in which this texture will be oriented, or which this particular cube will be oriented. So in our case, we can orient this along the camera, so you can see now, if you look very carefully, how we can actually see the edges of the cube are now reflected in this sphere, and you can see that the cube is pretty much oriented itself exactly to the camera. Or we could orient the cube to some kind of a screen space if we choose. So we, again, do have lots of different options to choose from as far as how this will be projected onto our object. Alright, so once we have this set up, we do have just a couple of other attributes that are found back inside the cube map itself. We have the actual cube size. Now this really doesn't come into play as far as being able to change the actual size of the cube here in your view. If I were to simply drop this down to 1, 1, and 1, you can see really nothing has happened. Now this does start to become a little bit more apparent if we start to adjust the point. This is really controlling your orientation of the cube, so if I were to begin raising this up, this will start to now move this cube upward, and you can see just a very slight amount makes a very significant amount of difference. That's where this size starts to come into play. So if I were to increase the size, now back to 10, 10, and 10, you'll notice that now these changes are much more difficult to see, or they're much more easy to control. So really, this overall size does not really make a big difference unless you are going to be coming in and starting to adjust the positioning of your cube. Alright, so that's a look at the cube1 environment lookup node.